Thank you, Darren, for the kind introduction. I appreciate that a lot. I also, to all of you who are here, I so appreciate being able to work with you. I have ties to some of your countries through my academic background, and I noticed there are folks from France, certainly, also from Brazil, and from Sweden. And I don't have academic ties in Sweden, but my family is from Agunnaryd. And so I get back to Sweden as often as I can. And again, that was was a bit of a prompt there. You'll see in the slide coming up next in terms of my connections in France and in Brazil. So I consider myself a practical applied academic. And in that role, I'm an author and an educator. I'm writing my sixth book, finished my sixth book. It's in my publication process at this point. And 4 of those are on crisis management directly. So I thought I would bring forth some of the basic issues on crisis management. My understanding of our session today is around leading around crisis management versus or in comparison to or in contrast to extreme context. So I'll set a little bit of the background that some of you maybe will be familiar with in regard to crisis management. I also, when we were setting up this session, one of the things we discussed was to talk about practical or applied approach. And again, I define myself quite sharply as a practical or applied academic. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of personal background. I'll go through it really quickly. I did a master's, so again, I don't know how much interest there is for you in the audience from personal, practical, or applied side, but let me just get a little bit of background that might give some contrast and comparisons in terms of Sean's background. I think we have 2 really different views here. We come to the same area in many regards, but the way we got there maybe is quite different. I come from a family that has no academics really in it at all. I did my master's degree. I had 2 young kids, chose the school because it was close to home, and they had a phenomenal childcare center. And it turned out to be a great place for me. My background's multidisciplinary in terms of my education. I did my undergrad in languages, French and Portuguese and Spanish, and even a little bit of Swedish, with a minor in economics. And then when I decided almost on a whim to go back and do a grad program, again, I went through the catalog of the closest college and really did a process of elimination about what I didn't want to focus on. So again, it's kind of an odd background, I suppose, for an academic. But anyway, in that, I made a very wise choice to do organizational psychology. I'd only had 1 psych course as an undergrad, but I loved it and was very drawn to trying to be a first-class noticer and understand people and interact with people and so forth. And it gave me a great platform then actually to go to USC, where I was sort of amazed that they accepted me, frankly. And that's not false modesty. I just, I again thought, well, I'll apply and see what happens. And frankly, I actually wanted to go to UCLA. My mother quickly killed that one because she made it very clear, and she was correct, that it was too far for me to commute. Again, family, little kids, all the rest of that. So I ended up at USC. Luck and just sort of getting out there and jumping on opportunities is a key theme, I think, in my background. And the luck in this case was that there were practical academics of unbelievable renown when I joined there. And I knew of 2 of them. The rest I didn't even know of until I was there. But people like Ed Lawler, James O'Toole, Warren Bennis, I begged and he agreed finally to become my dissertation chair. And then more familiar probably to your context, Ian Mitroff. So you'll see there on the bottom under USC Marshall, USC Center for Crisis Management is what those letters stand for. One of the other really unbelievably lucky circumstances for me was that as I was finishing my degree, Ian asked me to help found the center. He was just getting it started, and I became the first academic director and first senior research scientist for the center. We worked really closely together for the full time that I was there. After about 5 years, I decided that I wanted a more traditional academic position. And again, was very lucky to be hired by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's an amazing location, wonderful colleagues and all the rest of that. While I was there, I did a visiting at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Sao Paulo. And I believe there are some people whose email address, just quickly skimming through there, are from Fundação or at Fundação now. And I also did a visiting at ESSEC in Lille. And the international experience had started not only as an undergrad, or the international interest and study as an undergrad, but proceeded throughout my academic career and continues, of course. I was denied tenure at UNC. We had a brand new dean. As faculty told me, they tried to take him behind the barn and smack some sense into him. That was literally what they told me. But I went through 2 years of hearings, and both times the decision of the hearing committee, which was represented across the university, was that I should be granted tenure. However, the decision was in my new dean's hands, and he lasted about a year and a half or 2 years after I left. I was offered by him to stay on a permanent contract, but it gets into nonsense sometimes. The point of that is, again, it was good luck. Ivy picked me up with tenure. Ivy was a place I was at for just a couple of years. 9/11, to Sean's point, 9/11 happened my very first day of teaching at Ivy. And though I had never been I had not been particularly drawn to politics and sort of the esteem of the country, it did draw me back. Nonetheless, while I was at Ivy, I also had the opportunity to work with Cheng Yu-tung in Hong Kong as a visiting, sort of internal visiting kind of thing. Thunderbird approached me the second year, end of the first year I was at Ivy, made me an offer I couldn't resist in terms of the international scope of things, and I've been there essentially ever since. That little Thunderbird with a heart in it is the logo for Thunderbird for Good, which is our philanthropic arm of Thunderbird. And again, on the issue of opportunity and so forth, and just the theme of getting to the practical side, one of the things that I've done with them, many things with them since their founding about 12 or 14 years ago, is lead the educational aspect of a program for 100,000 women entrepreneurs in Peru. And again, just an example of kind of picking up on opportunities. We were acquired by ASU. Thunderbird was acquired by ASU 5 years ago. And it's despite a lot of concern among the Thunderbird faculty, in my view, from the very beginning, and it has panned out that way. It's just opened resources and opportunities, the best of which is that we have a new dean who joined us about 3 years ago, Sanjeev Kagram, who is unbelievable. Of all the deans I've worked with, good and horrible, but even among the really best, he's just outstanding. That 5327 is, again, a global number for me. I've had boots on the ground in 53 countries, and I've worked in 27 of them. So there's nothing more important to me, I suppose, from an intellectual perspective than to understand what cross-cultural world is all about and how it's changing and so forth. So just a little bit of background more tightly on organizational crisis management. These are the kinds of crises that I have helped organizations prepare for, deal with, learn from, sustain preparations and so forth. Sometimes it's run across all of those aspects. Sometimes it's been one of them, and a lot of variance across those. Darren kindly referred to Reframing Crisis Management, which Judy Clara and I authored in 1998. I'm going to show you the definition, unless I forget before we get to that. Getting it through AMR was a real test, as I'm sure you all are aware of, with the places that you publish that have high thresholds. It took us 3 years to get the definition approved. So it was a challenge, to say the least. I also have, I wrote the first international handbook for SAGE, edited the first international handbook for SAGE with Judy again and with Christophe Dufault. both names that are well known in crisis management, I hope by some of you as well, and have done practitioner articles as well. One of the first of those from Crisis Prone to Crisis Prepared, and the first crisis management book that came out of an academic setting, which Ian and I co-authored. These are some of the organizations that I've worked with over the years, again, in various phases of crisis preparation, just opening minds to what crisis is all about and what crisis management is all about. Also with some of them, helping them prepare, helping them learn from them, helping them as crises arose, helping them deal with some of the crises in real time. What you'll notice here probably, and by selection, these are the better known organizations, or a sample of the better known organizations I've worked with. But one of the things that became apparent in the early days of crisis management is that the organizations that planned for them tended to have deep pockets, and not in all cases, but in many cases, tended to have vulnerabilities. I wouldn't call them extreme contexts, and I think Sean and I probably see this pretty much the same, that people develop for the extremity of their context. If the organization survives, they prepare for that. But anyway, much to talk about there. This is just a quick span of the organizations and the impacts from them and from us, or from me in some cases, in regard to crisis management versus more around a recent venture I took into looking at the other end of the dark side continuum in terms of workplace incivility, and with that, aggression and violence as well. So to the fundamentals, just a couple more slides here. To the fundamentals, I thought I'd go back to, I didn't know that Darren would be talking about the article specifically, so many of you maybe are very aware of this. But we defined it at that time, this again took 3 years, a low probability, high impact event that threatens the survival of an organization. And I think that one, is pretty much common. You might make that guess if you just stop somebody on the street and say, what do you think organizational crisis is? It wouldn't take them too long probably to say, well, they don't happen very often, and the impact of it is really horrible, whatever. The idea of threatening the survival of an organization was a great distinguishing point for us, and has been not only in terms of academic work or articles and books and so forth, but especially in regard to helping managers and leaders at all levels understand what's the difference. And I can't tell you, how many conversations in organizations I have had with people as we're getting acquainted, when they will say to me, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here because every day's a crisis in my life. Well, they're not. So this is one way to sort that out. What I think is even more important to this definition, and perhaps it's a good thing it took us 3 years to get here, is the idea of mystery and misgivings, and that those mysteries and misgivings can be relevant to the cause, the effect, or the resolution of the crisis. The deeper I get into this, and I still, of course, continue research and continue reading, not only within this field, but also very far, or what might be seen as very far peripheral, distant fields, the more that piece of it, I think, is distinctive. This is just a quick word spread of, this includes some more recent types of crises. That tree I showed you actually is rather dated. It was in a part of a talk half a dozen years ago. So now we've got, cyber breach in there, global media attacks. Again, if you look at this fairly closely, some of the things that are here would not have been elements thinking back 5 or 6 years ago when I was designing that tree. So maybe marking time there makes some sense. I also thought it would be useful to go back to, for our discussion today, to go back to the objective of crisis leadership, which, and again, this comes from the Center for Crisis Management, from the work that we do with our sponsors. This probably took us 6 months of rather intense and intimate sponsor meetings to come to agreement across the sponsors and Ian and I, in terms of academics represented there, to make timely decisions based on the best facts and clear thinking when under extraordinary conditions. When I try to translate this just on a quick run through, I'm very much into talking about time versus certainty. When do you jump and say, okay, we need to do this now? And when do you say, boy, we just don't have enough information. We just got to wait it out. And that I think is one of the most difficult parts of leading through a crisis when you're the person who's having to make the judgment on that balance. The other thing that I find really helpful from a practitioner perspective, a managers and leaders perspective, is to think about crisis management as an effort to flatten the curve so that you up the ante in regard to preparation and planning and testing and practice, and in learning and improving and sustaining what you're learning and what has happened and why it happened and all sorts of questions that are related to that, so that when the crisis happens, it's not as intense, it's not as costly, and so forth. Early on, when I devised this model, I was presenting it to a really large audience, and a hand shot up in the back, and the guy said, well, I just did the math because I used to have actually a dotted line curve that showed the difference when you raise the arrows of the green and the arrows of the red. And apparently he had lowered the arrows of the red. And he said, the area under those two curves is exactly the same. So I don't see what benefit it is. We're putting in more cost, more resources and so forth. And it's still not really saving in the grand scheme. And of course, the difference is with that red arrow, we could be talking about the deaths of your business, your environment, and the people who are your stakeholders. So there is just a huge difference there. But anyway, this is the way that works for me and has worked for many people I've worked with from the practitioner side. The other thing I wanted to jump to just for a moment is, and it relates back to Sean's personal comments as well, I decided that it was time to take a renewed look, a refreshed look at organizational crisis management. And so I thought it would take me a year or two, and I was mostly going to revise things to just sort of, get into what the practical aspects were and sort of pump them up, maybe around the margins. That's going on 6 years now. And I just finished the book officially in terms of the final writing of it about a month ago. And just in some ideas here that are a bit different, I think, than what we typically see in the literature that's out there at this point in terms of crisis leadership. I mean, first thing for me is very often it's a line. Sometimes in more recent publications, it might be a circle. What I see among the different aspects of the cycle here is that they're very much intertwined, and that we kind of get a general sense here that it would go from the blue to the purple to the red to the green and come around again. But the reality when you're in the midst and actually leading through a crisis is you're bouncing among these all the time. The other thing that I am interjecting in this book that's now finished is the idea of starting with core organizational values and organizational crisis objectives. When I started down the venture putting this book together, it was stunning to me that those were not officially included in anything that I looked at. Maybe I missed some stuff out there in regard to the crisis management literature, but that's certainly the grounding point for all of this. And I think this is the last slide coming up here. So 4 things just really quickly in passing, and CMT means crisis management team, which I'm now calling the crisis leadership team because I think it's more appropriate. But what I decided I wanted to do after I was about a year or so into the writing of the book and research of the book was to take a really strong look at the kinds of trends that were happening that, in my view, at least, would most deeply impact changes needed. And they revolve around hypercompetition, globalization, no surprise there, I have a bias certainly, and the fourth industrial revolution. So just sort of looking at these 4 quickly, and then I'll stop there if anybody has questions. Starting in the upper right, that's intended to depict empowerment. And though we see empowerment in many organizations, many have moved from, and if you think of that triangle as an organizational hierarchy, have moved from the red to the gold circle. Depending on where you are, what your industry is, what your particular organization is and its founding and all the rest of that, it's quite likely that you move from the gold toward the green. What I find in crisis management is that seems not to have caught at all. As was the case when we were involved in starting the field, crisis management still is largely developed in the C-suites. The response tends to largely be generated from the C-suites, and there are problems in there. And there are problems related to the other three ovals here. When you have an organization that's global, you're not only on different time frames, you've got different response timing, but you've also got representation in areas where the values, norms, behaviors, and things we talk about as culture, where they can be very, very different. And so as an example, if you're sitting in headquarters in that red circle, and you're thousands of miles away in another country, you may be making assumptions that the people who represent your organization, your employees in an international setting will respond in the way that you've set up when a crisis happens. But there are lots of things from a cultural side that can make that absolutely a false assumption. And if you don't know that as a leader, that's serious business. The other two relate to each other on the bottom. The intention here is to represent, again, in some way, hyper-competition and fourth industrial revolution. It's no surprise to any of us, the issue of time compression. From that, the issue of internal competition, so that one with a little emoji type people is stepping on your own organization as you're trying to advance under the pressures of 4IR, under the pressures of time compression and so forth. To the left of that is the severing of the social contract between employees and employers. The fellow down there, that picture with the guy hanging himself by, or pretending to hang himself by his tie, is to represent how many people around the world who have the power to be unhappy about it are unhappy about their jobs. And the issue, again, of job dissatisfaction comes into play enormously. The issue of severing that connection from both sides. So from the organizational side, you have situations where you think you're treating your employees well, but what you expect as loyalty is no longer a guarantee. Not that it was ever a guarantee, but much less so the case than would have been even as recently as 5 or 10 years or less, even since just the start of the pandemic and changing under new work from home sorts of situations. The flip side of that as an employee, used to be the case through the history of leadership and so forth. In most organizations, if you did a good job, if you did what you were supposed to, maybe stretched a bit beyond that, you could be reasonably assured that you would have a job in that organization. And again, as we know from media and perhaps personal experience, that's no longer the case in many organizations, in many industries. So my goal in thinking about this for the last half dozen years and writing about it and delving into, again, other disciplines to look at some of these hyper-competitive global 4IR sorts of things from different angles, I think plays a big hand in how we think about crises and how we think about crisis management, and certainly the testing and creation of extreme contexts, and whether they'll remain that way forever or whether they're temporary and what those differences make. So I will stop sharing there. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but if so, I'm happy to handle them.